What's up, guys? Power Rods here. Today I'm gonna go over how to tune a carburetor and common issues people run into. Um, Carburetors get blamed for a lot of issues that are actually timing and tune issues. They're not carburetor. It's not a bad carburetor. It's not because it's a quadriprog or an idle junk or Holly. It's a lot of time it's just somebody adjusted something badly, or it's a timing issue, because they work synergistically. They work together. Timing and carburetors or fuel management are hand in hand. If you every time you adjust one, it affects the other. I'm going to cover a lot of information, and it's going to be pretty tech heavy. But I'm going to do my best to keep it simple and not over explain. There's a big difference between adjusting a race car or a drag car and racing and tuning a daily driver or a mild little street car. They're two very different things. So what I'm going to be talking about is more street car and something you're actually going to be out driving, not something that only sees, nothing, or, 3,000 to 8,000 RPMs. This is something you're generally going to be somewhere around 1,000 and 3,000 RPMs at, 90% of the time in the car. That's what we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of ways that people tune carburetors. This is just how I do it. So I'm just going to show you how I do it on daily drivers, and take it for what you will. Alright, before we get into it, I wanted to just show you, this is the basic tools you need to tune your carburetor. Timing light, vacuum gauge, temperature gauge, flat blade screwdriver. It really is that simple. Also, you'll need a wrench for your distributor tie down. Mine's a 5/8. Yours could be any kind of size. It just depends what someone's put in there in the past. But this should be all you need to get you good and tuned up. Alright, so the majority of the time, if you're having a problem with a carburetor, it's one of four things. You're either having an issue with timing, like we discussed. You're having a float height problem. Your floats aren't adjusted properly. You're having a fuel pressure issue, whether it's too much or too little. Or it's a transfer slots. People overlook transfer slots adjustments very often. And it's super common for people to just crank down on the curb idle screw to raise and lower their RPMs, when that's not how any of this works. But it's very common that happens. So we'll start there. So when I say transfer slot, what I'm talking about is, here's our carburetor. If you flip it upside down here and you look and you see this little hole right here, that is for our idle circuit. You'll see this screw lines up with that port. Same with the other one. That's where your idle mixture screw comes through, right? So just above that, you will see that little slot right there. That is what's known as the transfer slot. It transfers you from basically from off idle until you open up. So it's going to be, when you're cruising around, you're going to be in those transfer slots a lot. You're kind of just right here in this area. So in order to adjust it, you want to have it squared off. I know it's kind of hard to tell, but you'll see that's squared off. It's super simple. It's very easy to do, but it's super overlooked. People miss this all the time. I have had several guys ask me, oh, you know, this carburetor doesn't work for me, this and that. And then you look at it and transfer slots are wide open. And so what happens is you'll have a super high idle that you're not able to turn down. And it also can cause rich or lean conditions, you know, depending on where it's at. But that kind of covers that. We'll get a little bit more into it in a second, but we will move on. These transfer slots, they help add fuel to the engine whenever it's going from off idle throttle. So it adds fuel abruptly, and that's why it's so responsive. So if you have your curb idle adjuster, which is this guy here, the more you twist this in, what you're doing is you're adjusting your transfer slot. The second problem we're going to talk about, we kind of already covered it in the cleaning video, but it's float height. It's crucial that you have it correct, and each carburetor will have a spec. This can cause leaking carbs, lean stumbles, breaking up under acceleration. And it can be fixed by adjusting the float drop and height. On this Edelbrock, it's 7/16 height, and you can use a drill bit or tape measure, and it'll be a 13/16 drop. So that's pretty simple stuff, and like I said, I talked about it in the video before this, so go check that one out. All right. So now we have discussed that. The third common problem is going to be fuel pressure related. So you will see right here we've got our fuel pressure gauge on our Holley fuel regulator. There's our fuel line, goes into our car. Okay. So this can cause rich conditions, leaking carbs, lean conditions, fuel starvation, and so what happens is if you have too much pressure, this Edelbrock only takes 5.5 psi of fuel pressure. If we bounce that up, what will happen is it'll blow through the needle. It'll blow fuel through the needle and seat and flood the carb. And it'll make it bog, and if you have too little pressure, it'll starve the fuel bowls, and that's no good either. And then you're gonna have lean conditions and be running out of fuel and breaking up and popping, and not a good time at all. So you get a fuel pressure regulator and you regulate the fuel. A mechanical pump is fine. Electronic pump is ideal for the best. If you want to get the best tuning possible on a carburetor, electric is ideal because it'll cause you'll just have a constant pressure. I have a regular mechanical fuel pump on this engine, and it works just fine. And it pushes out about 8 pounds of fuel pressure, and I regulate that down to a right at about 5.5, maybe just a hair above for the wet shot. So yeah. And the fourth common problem is going to be timing. The good old dizzy. So, like I was saying earlier, timing works synergistically with carbs. Initial timing is what's used to set idle. Total timing is initial timing plus mechanical timing from the distributor. Too much timing is going to give you bad performance and cause you to overheat. Not enough timing is going to cause detonation and it can damage the engine. So you just adjust this by moving your distributor and also by changing out the springs inside of your distributor that cause the mechanical advance to kick in. So, you know, that's also that. And I may end up making a whole separate video on timing and distributors and all of that, but we're definitely going to cover it because that's a huge part of tuning your carburetor. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start tuning it, and from here I'm going to show you physically how to do it now that we've discussed everything. And we're going to start that out by squaring off the transfer slots, which you have seen that I actually already did that. So the reason that's the first step is because you have to have the carburetor pulled off to have them dialed in like that, right? So first thing you want to do is square those transfer slots off and make sure it's perfect right there. All right. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to get our base tune on our idle mixture screws. So that's going to be 2.5 turns out. That's not every carburetor, but yeah, it kind of is. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. Some people like to get it super lean and then fatten it up from a lean off of idle. Personally, I like to do the opposite, and I like to start fat and then lean it down. So what we do is we take our fuel mixture screws and we're going to turn them all the way in. We don't want to wrench these down because you'll flatten them and hurt them, and it's super bad for them, right? But you want to just kind of set them down until they stop. And when they stop, just leave them alone. So we're going to bottom them both out. All right, so they're both all the way out. Now we're going to give them 2.5 turns. Half, 1, half, 2, half. Half, 1, half, 2, half. All right, so now we're done there. All right, so we have our idle mixture screws are turned 2.5 turns out. Then, and our carburetor's fully mounted and all of that. Next thing we're gonna do is we're going to unplug our vacuum advance, and we're gonna plug that vacuum advance line and port. So slap that in there. That in there. Okay. Vacuum advance is plugged. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna attach a vacuum gauge. As you can see here, we've got us a vacuum gauge. You can see it sits on 0, so we're good. We're going to unplug our PCV line, which really all that matters is that we're pulling manifold vac. Manifold vacuum is going to be this guy on an Edelbrock. You'll know this because it is in the middle of the carb, in the middle of the intake, so it's pulling from both sides, not just one side. So both of these guys here are ported vac, And then this guy right here is manifold vac. The difference between ported vacuum and manifold vacuum when it comes to all this, the only difference is manifold vacuum is pulling vacuum at idle, right? And with ported vacuum, if your transfer slots are squared off like they should be, ported vacuum should be pulling no vacuum at all. So if you're ever dealing with a carburetor that you haven't had off of the vehicle and you want to get a good idea of where your transfer slots are at, you can pull vacuum from the ported vacuum, and if it has vacuum at idle on that ported vacuum, then that means your transfer slots are way wide open and they need to be adjusted. So we have our vacuum gauge here. The next thing you're going to need, or next thing we're going to do, is we're going to hook up a timing light. As you can see, you got a negative, positive, and here's our magnetic pickup, and here's our timing light. A dial back timing light is ideal so that you can check total timing and all of that, and it's just a lot easier to deal with. Mine broke, so we're going old school, and we're just using your regular old cheap timing light. As you should know, that right there is how we're going to point the light there, and it'll light up and show us where exactly our timing is at. So another little trick. So when you square off those transfer slots, what you're going to run into is you're going to say, well, Daniel, I squared off my stuff and I did exactly what you said, but when I try to turn it on, it idles super low and I can't get it to stay on. Okay, and that's fine. That's how it goes. So what you can do is you will take that curb idle screw and you will turn it clockwise half of a turn. Boom, there's our half turn. Now that will help you get it idled up, or whenever you first start it up. Now before we start it, we want to go ahead and loosen up our distributor tie down bolt, so that way we can adjust timing on the fly. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is you go ahead and start it, and it's going to take a second for some fuel to get up to the carburetor and fill up the bowls. But if you want to squirt some fuel down into the vents and fill up the bowls manually and give it a couple squirts for a little quicker startup, you can do that. Either way, it's fine. But now it's super important that we bring the engine up to operating temperature. Once we have brought the engine up to operating temperature, I like to go ahead and I'll take my half turn of curb idle out of it so that we're back to being squared up. That's going to cause my idle to drop a good amount. You know, it'll kind of start acting super hesitant. We're going to go ahead and advance our timing a little bit, which should cause the idle to raise back up. Now, the reason that we are using a timing light on an old engine that's got 100, 200,000 miles on it, it's going to need more timing than a brand new built engine or a race engine, right? So generally speaking, on an old daily driver type small block Chevy, big block Chevy, whatever, because this is all the same, no matter Ford, Dodge, Chevy, it doesn't matter. It's all this. Carburetors and timing is the same. Yeah, so I like to start out, I try to get in that 8 to 12 degrees initially. And like I said, I'm using my distributor to set my idle speed. But 8 degrees to, we'll say 20 degrees is that's not a big deal for an older engine. Old engines need more timing. So if you've got an old engine and in order to get it to idle correctly and get everything how you like it, and it's got 16 degrees of timing into it, that's not a big deal. That's nothing to worry about. I won't get too far into that, but it has to do with cylinder pressure, and old worn out rings and worn out valves are going to require more timing to fire off the fuel mixture off most optimally. And like I said, we'll go over timing in a little bit more detail in a different video, and we'll probably even cover vacuum, manifold versus ported as well, and we'll go a little deeper into all of that. But and the reason that we're having the timing light, because you might say, well, if we're using the timing to control the idle, why do we care about the amount of timing into the engine? Well, this is just our safety net. This is to make sure we're not adding a stupid amount of timing and band-aiding other problems, right? So that's the reason we have the timing light. I know this engine, so I know that it generally likes, 14 degrees of timing generally. And yeah. So once we've got it up to operating temperature, and we'll take our half a turn out of it, and then we'll add some timing into it until we get our desired idle. So now we're going to go ahead and say we have the idle speed we want. Now we're going to go ahead and start adjusting our idle mixture screws. Now, a lot of people want to tune one side and then go do the other side, and a lot of people have different methods of doing all of this, but what I like to do is I treat both sides equally. So I'll start and I'll take a half turn out of this side and a half turn out of this side. And then we'll see what that does to our vacuum. And if it goes up, good. We'll give our carburetor a couple good revs, let everything settle, check our idle, see where our idle speed is at, and then we'll take another quarter turn out of this one, another quarter turn out of this one. And if our vacuum continues going up, we'll give it a rev, we'll see where she's at. And we'll keep doing this until we get our highest vacuum. Once we have our highest vacuum, and we've revved it up and it's holding steady where we want it, we'll go ahead and give it a quarter turn rich. So what we're doing is we're bringing it to the leanest that it will run and get it optimal. And then in order to be on the safe side, we go ahead and give it that quarter turn to richen it up just to be safe. Some people do an eighth turn back. I like a quarter just to be safe. If you do a quarter and you're fouling out plugs, well, maybe then go to that eighth turn, or you can play with it. It's whatever. Every engine's a little bit different. Every engine likes things a little bit differently. So now once we've done that, we're gonna go ahead and rev it back up, and we're gonna just say that we've got our highest idle, we've put our half turn to richen it back up. But now what you're going to find is you have a high idle or low idle, and then we're going to adjust our timing to get our desired idle speed. Now, a desired idle speed can depend on what kind of vehicle you've got, what you're using it for, all of that. Generally speaking, you want your idle to be somewhere between 700 RPMs and 850 RPMs. And if you're not able to get that with just twisting on the distributor, it's okay to give that curb idle screw, I don't know, up to maybe a half a turn if you're wanting to idle at 1,000 RPMs or so. I personally don't really like to do that, but it's totally safe. It's not a big deal. Half a turn isn't going to ruin your tune, But so some people like to do it that way. I've never had an issue with just adjusting my distributor and getting my idle that way. But what you're going to notice when you tune your carburetor this way is that off idle, it's going to be very responsive. There's not going to be any breaking up or bog or popping. It's going to be a very instant off idle. It's going to be very responsive, super fast, and your engine's going to feel really good. You're going to know if you do this correctly, you're going to know that you did it correctly by the way it drives. So yeah, and now I'll just now that we've gone through all of that, I'll go ahead and video me doing all of that. right, guys, that's how you tune it right there. Something that I didn't show in the video, but I did, is I checked all of the headers. I went ahead and shot temperature on all of them and made sure it was relatively close, you know, within 15-20 degrees, give or take. And all that's doing is making sure if you have a misfire, you're gonna know it super quickly. Yeah, so I didn't show that, but that's something that I do. Now that we've finished it up, we've got the most amount of vacuum, we've got the desired idle. We set our final idle with the engine warmed up and in the drive gear. If you're on it in an automatic like this, then you're gonna go ahead and slap it in drive and have somebody inside holding the brake, and then set your idle that way. Now the last thing we want to do, just make sure we go ahead and slap our PCV back on, put our vacuum advance from our distributor back on, and slap our air cleaner, and now she's ready to go. That's all there is to it, fellas.